Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 5th of April 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're joined by Alex Thompson with Eastern Approaches. And of course, Alex reporting from deep in the Netherlands. Well, we need to start with some serious news, and I'm afraid we're back on run, hide, tell. No, the nasty Russians are not coming on this occasion, Mike. It's apparently the North Koreans, and I think that the public should brace themselves for this BBC expose. Let's have a look at it. Well, here we are. BBC News, North Korea missile could reach UK shores within months. And the article had a picture. This, of course, was one of the older and faster missiles, Mike.
Right.
But I thought this was extremely interesting headline. That we'd got a missile that was going to take some months to come to the UK. So I did a little bit of work on this. I established that the distance North Korea to UK was about 5,500 miles, depending on where you were targeting, of course. I assumed 2 months, because that was the plural. There was the 2 months of the travel time. And according to this BBC article, this missile was going to come in at roughly 3.8 miles per hour.
Excellent.
Okay, so plenty of warning time. Now, many people will be thinking, yes, Brian, but this is a bit unfair because that was only the headline. Well, of course, that's absolutely true. It was the headline. But really the message from this article was be afraid, be very afraid. I read it. I wasn't afraid of the North Koreans, but I was afraid of the BBC. Let's have a look at some of the substance of this article. The missile could reach UK shores, apparently. It could.
Maybe.
It really could, couldn't it? North Korea will almost certainly be able to reach UK with a missile in 6 to 18 months' time. And I thought, my goodness, that's a very slow missile indeed.
Yeah.
What do we got? No evidence that no evidence that North Korea could arm, this missile, that should be, with nuclear warheads. So what's the article about, Mike?
It's just nonsense.
It's just nonsense, yep. North Korea has carried out 6 nuclear tests and has a ballistic missile that experts believe could put the whole of the US in striking range. In doing so, Pyongyang said it had achieved its mission of becoming a nuclear state. So my question is, is there a nuclear threat to the UK or not?
Not.
Well, okay, because that missile only goes in one direction, apparently. Presumably it's a bit faster. UK could be the target of cyber attacks by the regime, and that's based on no evidence of last May's WannaCry attack. So I'm going to say just the most appalling fake news by the BBC, you can't call it anything else, that having tried to frighten the British public about nuclear missiles and failed, they just dribble in very carefully that, of course, if you're not worried about that, those nasty North Koreans are going to get us for a cyber attack.
Aside from anything else, and I'll ask Alex for comment in a second, aside from anything else, Brian, it's complete nonsense because Donald Trump, the South Koreans and the North Koreans are all getting together to discuss this. North Korea has made it clear that it will drop its nuclear program if those negotiations are successful. The amount of media coverage at the moment over Donald Trump, they're really pretty confused by him. We've mentioned this a few days ago because of what the BBC was confused on the Radio 4 Today programme last week, because, of course, he's not talking about the Skripal case. He's not talking about a whole range of different things that the BBC and the British government would like him to talk about. So he was giving a press conference with the presidents of 3 Baltic states yesterday, and he said, we want to be able, if possible, and this is speaking with the Baltic states, ideally we want to be able to get along with Russia. Getting along with Russia is a good thing, not a bad thing. And he said that he was asked if Vladimir Putin was going to come to the White House. He said, well, maybe we will, maybe we won't. And probably nobody has been tougher on Russia than Donald Trump. But if you take a look at our military strength now, which would not have happened had the opponent won, if you take a look at the oil and gas that we're producing now, we're independent. We're now exporting oil and gas. This is not something that Russia wanted. But then he said, he was asked if he thought Russia was a friend or a foe, and he said, "We'll find out. I'll let you know." I mean, there's time. There will be a time when I'll let you know. You're going to find out very quickly. We'll see what happens. So this is typical Donald Trump language. But the point is, on his Twitter feed is complete silence with regard to the Skripal affair. He has used his Twitter feed in the past to be very, very hard on North Korea. And North Korea has responded. And then with regard to Syria, then he is also saying that he wants to get out of Syria, bring the troops back home as quickly as possible. Sometimes it's time to come back home, and we're thinking about that very seriously. He said that the primary mission for keeping a military presence in Syria, was the defeat of Islamic State. And given that is almost completed, he said it's time to bring them home. That's much to the disgust of Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu. But that's the situation. So, Alex, this BBC article is just an utter disgrace, really, because, first of all, they're misrepresenting the current situation with regard to North Korea. But this is in line with their misrepresenting the current situation with regard to Trump. So they're really misrepresenting just about everything.
There's not much that they're not misrepresenting, Mike. I just asked a Russian friend how he would characterize with one of those pithy Russian proverbs what's been going on with the BBC scraping the bottom of the barrel to find more scare stories on the North Koreans and the Russians. And he came back with the rhyming proverb, "Svinya грязь найдет и в хлев принесет." A pig will always find some muck and bring it back to the sty.
Yes.
That seems to be, the measure of things. But it's not just the BBC, Mike, that we're worried about here. If you look at the Times, we can't go reporting individual comments that we screenshotted, but we do keep logs of the membership-only, subscription-only comments that are under the Times articles. There is a frightening number of establishment people, basically the upper middle class, to use that kind of terminology, who are posting all kinds of credulous stuff, which they've got from BBC. Channel 4 seems to have defected as of last night, but the BBC and the Times are still on script with this. And they're posting things like, because of the nasty Russians, we have to preserve free speech by closing down comment sections. And the EU, our masterful EU, has never been so strong and united in the face of Russia. Well, we'll see about that anon in this news. But that's the page we're on. As regards North Korea, I would just add it's very questionable how North Korea got hold of whatever stage it is at in its nuclear technology. People may have forgotten by now, but a Pakistani scientist called A.Q. Khan, Khan, was the man who gave both Iran and North Korea, it seems under the CIA's, shall we say, tolerating nose, gave them the crucial acceleration technology, and A.Q. Khan did it while he was just up the road from here at the Technological University of Delft, while the Dutch security service was supposedly keeping tabs on him on behalf of the Brits and Americans. So that doesn't quite add up. I think we are creating our own enemies here.
Yes, isn't that what happened in 1984? Isn't that the way it worked?
Perpetual war.
Yes.
Okay, well, let's have a look at some of the mainstream newspapers. So we'll start with the Mail. More crass reporting, I can't think of another word for it, by Larissa Brown, Defence and Security Editor. Russia tested using nerve agent with poison spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter on door handles. They needed to actually find out whether they could smear door handles, apparently. Russia has explored carrying out assassinations by using Novichok on door handles. I'd like to see the evidence for that, please, Daily Mail.
Surely it must be in the article.
No, unfortunately not. Police have already said they believe the nerve agent was smeared on Skripal's BMW. Well, hang on a minute. They did in the beginning, and then they said, no, it was smeared on the door handle of the house. But I think this is a smear story.
Right.
Okay. British intelligence agencies have evidence of the tactics being used previously. No, they haven't. There's been no evidence put in the public domain whatsoever. There are claims. Agents claim to know Moscow also tested the lethal poison on everyday objects. This is astonishing investigation by Larissa Brown. I wonder whether she is actually watching the programme. So we got this embedded in that article. Why fingers are pointed at Putin. 8 days after the nerve agent attack on Sergei Skripal and his daughter, the Prime Minister convened an urgent meeting of the National Security Council. where they delivered a chilling assessment. It was highly likely Russia was behind the attack. An assessment, that means you don't actually quite know, you're making an assessment. It was highly likely, that's not known fact. One source said it was a straightforward assessment. Well, I bet it was, because they entered the meeting knowing they were going to blame the Russians. I can't go through all of this, but it says world-leading experts at Porton Down Defence Research Laboratory identified the chemical in Salisbury as the Novichok nerve agent. The UK has evidence that Russia has previously produced this agent and is still capable. Intelligence gathered within the past decade, Russia has investigated ways of delivering nerve agents for assassination. Not only this, British intelligence agents have evidence that Russia has explored using Novichok on door handles and everyday objects. This is incredible stuff, Mike.
Amazing.
Amazing. And international allies have handed over top secret intelligence that points to Russia, not irrefutable evidence, just pointing in the general direction of. And on it goes. I can't read any more because it's just too pathetic. We've got the Times. Now, this is a very, very interesting spin. UK locates the source of Novichok nerve agent used in Salisbury. What are they really on about here? Well, let's just have a look at this little bit. Security services believe that they have pinpointed the location of the covert Russian laboratory that manufactured the weapons-grade nerve agent used in Salisbury. How is this possible when Porton Down has said absolutely it can't determine where this stuff came from?
Yes. Alice in Wonderland stuff, really, isn't it?
We'll come back to Alex in a second. Ministers and security officials were able to identify the source using scientific analysis and intelligence in the days after the attempted murder. Well, we know now that they haven't been able to do that. And Britain knew about the existence of the facility where the Novichok poison was made before the attack. Well, that's remarkable. Why didn't they stop the attack then?
Yes.
Alex, this is fantasy. I'm running out of adjectives to describe this. This is pure fantasy and make-believe by the British government, and the mainstream news and newspapers are just falling into line.
But only the British mainstream ones, Brian. As you go out from Britain in concentric rings, you see increasing levels of incredulity about the British claims, and that is really new since the equivalent case last decade, the Litvinenko case, and certainly since the Cold War. Someone in the chat box has just quite aptly said that the British famous turn of phrase about it, highly likely that it was a Russian targeting, that he calls that horse poo. And indeed, he's in good company there, because no less a figure than the president of the Czech Republic, Miloš Zeman, as I have a slide about later, has said exactly the same thing. What exactly do the British mean by this language of highly likely? Now, the Czechs, okay, a key Central European ally, a new Europe country, that's bad enough. But actually, there's more to it than that. The Czechs were a staging post for the Syrian chemists who had Soviet-era chemical weapons knowledge to get to the West. And they seem to have turned against Britain now because they can't put up with this nonsense anymore. And in fact, the Czechs, if I'm right in saying, have Europe's only CBRN-ready battalion. They have that much expertise. And in an early stage of EU military union, it was already being said 15 years ago to me, the Czechs will have the battalion, or have the battalion that will be the EU military's single CBRN battalion. The French may have one. We've scrapped ours as of 2012, but the Czechs are the lead. So for the president of that country to say the British are talking out of their backsides is really something.
Right, okay, let's follow through the Skripal case a little bit more. We want to really rub this home that the facts do not stack up. Just a reminder on screen of some of the effects of Novichok. Now remember, they are saying that this is a weapons grade nerve agent. What is that designed to do? Kill people in very, very small doses very, very quickly. And the aim is for death within minutes, possibly a few hours. But the aim of these sorts of chemicals are that they are so dangerous. Once you've ingested them or had them on your skin, you are going to die within a very, very short space of time. Interesting, death seems to have dropped out of a lot of the comment by the mainstream papers in particular. They simply don't talk about this being a nerve agent to cause death. But this is what we're to believe. We're to believe that Sergei and Yulia were contaminated at home. They then go to the pub, have a meal, and are subsequently found on a bench, rocking, shaking. And one eyewitness said that it was only possible to see the whites of Yulia's eyes, and she had soiled herself. If that witness is correct and accurate, these are the exact symptoms, the classic signs of nerve agent poisoning. So we have a remarkable situation that they're sitting on the bench, not just showing slight symptoms. These are people who are on the route to death, if this is weapons-grade nerve agent. Novichok and other military-grade nerve agents are designed to incapacitate or kill in seconds and minutes, possibly a very few hours, and there's no, I feel a bit unwell. And of course, for the military, if you don't get the EpiPens in with atropine in a few sections, you were going to be dead within minutes, and that is what you were continually told. This nerve agent, Novichok, 10 times more potent than some of the earlier ones, so we know exactly what we're dealing with. In Salisbury, between the Skripals leaving their house, the alleged source of the agent, and being found on the bench, several hours had elapsed. Why were they not found dead on the doorstep of their home? That's a question we can leave in the air. Let's bring in the next thing. We're then to believe that a policeman attends the scene of the crime at the bench, and in touching Sergei and Yulia, he is cross-contaminated. However, more time elapses during the wait for emergency services, the ambulance, and in the drive to the hospital, and in the initial assessment. No treatment was possible until the poison or nerve agent was identified, and this could not have happened until Porton Down or equivalent specialists were called in. My point here, Mike, is hours are going by while we have these people who are severely poisoned with a weapons-grade nerve agent. As the emergency teams arrive at the bench, in the ambulance and in the hospital, others would have touched the Skripals. Raw nerve agent on their clothes or in bodily fluids would have posed an ongoing risk. And if we just follow it through for the final bit, if the policeman was cross-contaminated, how long was it before the effects were noticed? It cannot have been immediately, because if that was the case for the policeman, the Skripals would have been affected immediately on their doorstep at home. If the policeman was cross-contaminated, how was it that no other emergency staff were poisoned? A brush past clothing is enough. And are we to believe here that the Novichok was delayed action? If so, it could not have been military grade. So whichever way you go, the government version is not true. This anomaly is particularly pertinent in that the government rapidly made a big play of teams running around Salisbury searching out areas of contamination. No boundary to the initial contamination was ever established, and if it had been in light of a military-grade nerve agent, then people would have been carefully evacuated and a properly planned decontamination programme for Salisbury put in place. And let's bring in the final bit. Instead, any professionally trained person in chemical weapon decontamination watched a pantomime. Skripal's car was towed away with an ill-fitting plastic sheet over it, a massive cross-contamination risk as it had been identified as a seat of nerve agent. The towing truck was also a cross-contamination risk, not only by the presence of the car, but by the truck driver himself who would have loaded it. So where was the assessed contaminated truck taken? To a public car pound, and later the media was reporting the authorities had lost track of where these vehicles were. I'll come back to you very quickly, Alex. Whatever way you go into this story, if it was weapons-grade Novichok, the tale as told by the British government cannot possibly be true.
There is no way to make it stack up, Brian. Some wag on the Russian version of Craigslist has set up an account in the name of Salisbury Metal Industries, and he's flogging a picture of a park bench. And he says this is the Skripal bench, and I'm asking 1.6 million rubles for it because it has magical material properties. And that's the kind of level of farce we have descended to here. One point on this, and I am not blaming the Royal Marines in any way, but it is very, very odd that on the 6th of March, which is 48 hours after the Skripals had been hospitalised, the Ministry of Defence put out a press statement that there had just been on Salisbury Plain a 3-week exercise coordinated with DSTL Porton Down, in which 40 Commando, which is pretty much the most capable regular forces unit Britain has, one of the finest elite non-special forces units in the world, had just been doing 3 weeks of CBRN training right there. I don't understand how that works.
That's a very good question, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm just going to smile, I think.
Yes. Let's move on to events yesterday then, because Russia had called a special session of the Executive Council of the OPCW, the Organization for Prevention of Chemical Weapons. Basically, this is the head of that organization. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce his name. Alex can maybe help me with that in a minute. He issued a statement, just an updated statement just prior to the meeting. And it's worth just going through this because it gives us a bit of the timeline as to what exactly the relationship between the UK and the OPCW what that was about. And I think he has released this to answer the questions that Russia had asked a few days ago. So he said the United Kingdom requested technical assistance from the Secretariat in relation to this matter specifically, the Skripal case. It requested the Secretariat to identify the nature of the toxic chemical reportedly used through the analysis of samples collected by OPCW technical experts. The assistance was requested and is being provided pursuant to Article 8, Paragraph 38 of the Chemical Weapons Convention, which states that the Secretariat will provide technical assistance and technical evaluation to states parties in the implementation of the provisions of the Convention, including evaluation of scheduled and unscheduled chemicals. Information provided by the authorities of the United Kingdom has been aimed at facilitating the technical work of the Secretariat's team of experts. On the 19th of March 2018, an advanced team of OPCW experts deployed to the United Kingdom for preliminary discussions in connection with the technical assistance visit. Following this, a full team deployed on the 21st of March 2018. The technical assistance team was led by and composed of highly qualified officials of OPCW. In keeping with its standard practice, the Secretariat does not disclose the identities of members of teams or mission planning details to state parties other than the state party hosting the technical assistance visit. The OPCW experts visited the locations where 2 of the victims were reportedly exposed to a toxic chemical and collected several environmental samples. The team also took biomedical samples from these 2 victims, as well as from a third individual, a police officer reportedly exposed to a toxic chemical. These samples were sealed and brought to the OPCW laboratory on the 23rd of March 2018. Samples were split in the presence of an expert from the UK, and the UK was provided with 1 split of each sample. The environmental samples were then delivered to 2 designated laboratories, and the biomedical samples were delivered to 2 other designated laboratories. The collection, splitting and transportation of the samples were carried out in line with the relevant procedures of the Secretariat. The chain of custody was fully maintained. States parties are not informed of the designated laboratories selected by the Secretariat to perform the technical analysis. The results of the sample analyses are expected to be received by early next week. Once the results of the analyses of the samples are received, the Secretariat will produce a report on the basis of these results and will transmit a copy of the report to the United Kingdom. The report will reflect the findings of the designated laboratories access of other state parties to the report will be subject to the agreement of the United Kingdom. So that's pretty important. The report will go to the UK, but Russia is not likely to get a copy of it because the UK is likely to embargo that. We'll see, but that's probably what's going to happen. He goes on to say, pursuant to the confidentiality annex of the convention, the OPCW policy on the confidentiality and the consistent practice in relation to other technical assistance visits, the UK has expressed a wish to be as transparent as possible and has already indicated its preference for disclosure of the report to other states parties. Well, we'll see. OPCW team worked independently and is not involved with the national investigation by UK authorities, and no state party is involved in technical work that's being carried out by the Secretariat. So that was released prior to that meeting yesterday and answers many of the questions, possibly not all the questions that the Russians asked. So then there was the special session of the Executive Council in which Russia had put forward a proposal that an investigation should be a joint UK-Russian investigation. This, of course, was something that the UK was absolutely against. Boris Johnson issued a statement following the meeting. He said the purpose of Russia's ludicrous proposal at The Hague was clear: to undermine the independent, impartial work of the International Chemical Weapons Watchdog. Russia has had one goal in mind since the attempted murders on UK soil, and through the use of military-grade chemical weapons to obscure the truth and confuse the public. And he said that following the vote, that Russia was robustly defeated at this meeting. So there were 41 countries in attendance at the meeting, and according to the Foreign Office, 6 of the 41 members voted in favour of Russia, 15 voted against Russia, which that included the UK. So that's 6 for Russia, 15 against, 17 abstained, 2 were absent, so they didn't want to turn up at all, and 1 wasn't entitled to vote. And that is apparently a robust vote against Russia. I'm not quite clear how it is, but maybe you have a different view, Brian. Now, Russia's embassy in the Netherlands, Alex, had said that 14 countries had backed the Russian proposal. What I find a little disturbing, bearing in mind that there's lots of discussion there from the OPCW about transparency, is that there's no record on the OPCW website or on their media page. There are several documents, including statements from several nation states and the European Union about that were made during this meeting, but there's no actual definition of the vote on the OPCW page. So I'm not clear whether it was 6 voted with Russia or whether it was 14 voted with Russia. I suppose if the Foreign Office has put out the numbers, we must believe them, mustn't we? But nonetheless, it's hardly what you would describe as a robust endorsement of the UK's position.
Far from it, Mike. There is much that's left to be desired in how the OPCW attacks its work. I've spoken to Middle Eastern former ambassador accredited to the OPCW here in The Hague, who said that it's often very amateurish, and that's something he wouldn't have said lightly. The gentleman whose long statement you were reading there, Ahmet Üzümcü, is very interesting, because if you cast your mind back to the Khan Shaykhun incident in April last year, almost exactly a year ago, Mr. Üzümcü was accused of being an Anglo-American stooge in all this. Well, there may be something to that. Someone has posted his Wikipedia biography in the chat room. I haven't looked at it, but I know off the top of my head that he was very closely involved with NATO for most of his career. And that, quite apart from that, senior Turkish diplomats in sensitive positions are quite routinely MIT officers, which is the Turkish intelligence organization very closely controlled by the CIA since the 60s. So there's every likelihood, and besides, he'll be on full NSA GCHQ cover. Possibly the Russians will have him on cover as well, but they have fewer means there. But he has no secure communications. Signally, in what you read out there, Mike, it's only the British who know the nationalities and backgrounds and credibility of the officers from the OPCW who came. They could be from Western stooge countries again. So there's a lot really that has been left to be desired in the whole situation.
Effectively, Russia is being kept out of. It's been accused of a crime, but it's being kept out of the procedure. And you've got to ask the question: if this is the standard procedure which is being followed, it doesn't seem to be a terribly robust procedure in itself. But anyway, let's have a brief look at Russia's response here. So this is Sergei Naryshkin, head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, and he was at the opening ceremony of the Moscow Security Conference, which we'll come on to in a second. He said that we need to stop raising the stakes irresponsibly and projecting power into interstate relations to avoid a new crisis. He said that the West's way of projecting power today is stunningly hypocritical. He said the Skripal affair is a grotesque provocation crudely staged by British and US intelligence agencies. And he went on to say that there's a greater need to reset the international relations system to make it work. And for that to happen, countries would have to abandon double standards, start speaking in a truly common language of humanity before it's too late. He said big talk about human rights and democracy was accompanied by military interventions into sovereign nations. Those nations were plunged into bloody chaos that had no place for such fundamental right as a right to live. Over the past 2 decades, hundreds of thousands of innocent people fell victim to NATO aggression in Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, and it's hard to really criticise that statement. Dmitry Peskov, who is Putin's spokesman, said that the British have no evidence. He said that London somehow will have to offer its apologies to the Russian side, but obviously it's going to be a long story, and the idiocy of it has gone too far. The British Foreign Secretary, who accused President Putin, and the British Prime Minister will have to look in the eyes of their EU colleagues after telling them what they said. The situation was iniquitous for us from the very beginning, and now there emerges evidence that these mad accusations the British side voiced just a few hours after the incident are based on nothing. They're going to have to look in the eyes of their EU colleagues. Alex, do you think the UK really is going to end up feeling embarrassed about this as this sort of house of cards they've built around themselves collapses?
I do, Mike, and some of my later slides will show this. Not even our immediate neighbours, the Irish and Dutch, okay, one is neutral and out of NATO and has sensitivities with us, and the other is pretty pro-British, not even they at a government or mainstream press level are believing our story. We are totally exposed. Mr. Peskov is quite right to talk about the European angle of this, because he knows that the British are isolated within Europe in a way that they've never been before. On this now, Mr. Peskov also gave an interview to Sophie Shevardnadze, former Georgian President Shevardnadze's granddaughter, on Russia Today in English, in which he was asked about the Trump-Putin relationship. And to confirm what you were saying earlier, he also said Mr. Trump himself is well-meaning towards us. We're quite well aware of this, but his siloviki, his strongmen around him, are not permitting him to exert that policy. So the Russians are well aware that the game to play, or they're letting it play itself out because of British stupidity, is that the British will be left with egg on their faces in the corridors of Europe. And they're increasingly realise the Americans are not going to ride to the rescue. They have neither the will nor the power anymore.
Well, I thought this was a fascinating comment. This is Willie Wimmer, the ex-Vice President of the OSCE. We'll come on to the OSCE a little bit in a minute once we talk about the Moscow Security Conference. But Britain behaving like a mafia state in the Skripal case, a pretty strongly worded statement, and I do recommend people go to RT. Speaking on RT, go to the RT website. The headline is "Britain behaving like a mafia state in the Skripal case." What do you know about Willie Wimmer, and is this a surprising position for him to take on this?
I have to confess that Willie Wimmer is not a name I've heard of. Could be Flemish, Dutch or German. But what I will say is that at that level, when you're vice president of OSCE, at least in the old system until the mid-2000s, probably in his era, you were basically nominated by your own country's foreign ministry on a rotational basis. So these officers in the OSCE, which is one of these talking shops managed from Vienna to keep East and West talking to each other, the officers who were put into those positions represent the diplomatic, frank view of their host countries' foreign ministries. They're not career international civil servants in the way that people at the OPCW or the like are. So this is very much, frankly, what old Europe is thinking about the Brits again.
Right.
Okay, well, we just bring this in very quickly, but it's extremely important. I'm sorry, I should have labelled this because I did take this from Russia Today, but nevertheless, it's factually correct, embedded information. So we've got Boris Johnson here being interviewed by German state media, and this is the clip in which he says, "I was told by Porton Down that the Novichok came from Russia." And what's going on in the background? Well, we've got Chris Williamson MP in a general discussion with others. He said, so what does this mean? Well, it means that the UK escalated tensions with Russia based on deductive evidence that is guided by secret info from our security services. And he goes on, but as Jeremy pointed out, and as I also said on Newsnight, it was that kind of non-transparent evidence that formed the basis for Britain's disastrous invasion of Iraq. So it's pretty clear that people are now beginning to think for themselves, and when they do that, they can see that it's pretty easy to deduce that the British government is not telling the truth at best, but is deliberately lying at worst.
Just to end off this section, Alex, you've published a blog post on the UK column, keeping abreast of the Skripal case, some recommended articles.
Because there is so much to keep track of, I'm just rounding up the most striking things I found. You'll find it from the bottom right hand of the front page under latest comment. There's something there on the establishment line, on the pattern of gruesome deaths, with a link to a 6-parter on how many Russian oligarchs and British accountants for them have died gruesome deaths. Geopolitical, the Chinese allying with Russia on this. Parallels with the Litvinenko case and disagreement on who actually murdered Mr. Litvinenko. Consular access, which is still unresolved. And the blood samples, by the way, that were asked in this High Court case, in which I refer to in that section of the blog, that is the biomedical samples that Mr. Uzumju was talking about, I believe. The striking fact that Yulia Skripal or someone managed to access her social media account on Vkontakte 3 days after she was poisoned. The coincidental Royal Marines exercise, and also the Irish and Dutch mainstream press, the most pro-British parts of those press actually, talking about the British probably having done it themselves, which is just jaw-droppingly unprecedented. And at the bottom, something about a Cambridge Analytica angle. The one thing I haven't put in that blog is the possibility, which the Germans are talking about, that the timing of this all has something to do with the Nord Stream pipeline getting the go-ahead, which is the gas politics again. The alternative route to that is the Baltic pipeline. If so, then it's a sign that even the Germans have peeled off from supporting the British, which on such a Russia handling angle is again very unprecedented and means that we have nobody left at our side in Europe at all except the French, our co-complicitors.
Okay, well, as I mentioned, the 7th Moscow International Security Conference taking place at the moment, 850 guests, including defense ministers, delegations from ministries of defense around the experts and people from universities.
Academics.
Yes, thank you. In 95 countries. The heads of several international organizations, including the UN, the OSCE, that's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Collective Security Organization, Shanghai Security Organization, Commonwealth of Independent States, and International Community of the Red Cross. 700 representatives of domestic and foreign mass media there as well. So that's going on at the moment. Nikolai Patrushev, the Secretary of the Russian Security Council, he opened the conference. He read a message from Vladimir Putin in which he said that ISIS, despite its defeat in Syria and Iraq, retains significant destructive potential. It can change its tactics and launch attacks in different countries and regions of the world. And so it's necessary for some cooperation between the attendees at that conference in order to deal with that potential problem, in order to prevent further spread of the threat. He said it's important to organise international cooperation in order to terminate the activity of foreign terrorists, including those returning from flashpoints, and the effective sharing of information on those terrorists, their movements and plans. Countries outside the region should not be allowed to intervene in sovereign states' domestic affairs under the pretext of the war on terror. So that was Putin's position on that. But that conference continues, and we'll cover that as much as we can.
Okay, well, it's over to you, Alex. Skripal fallout, the rapidly shrinking Anglosphere.
I'll just talk through several of these at once. I have mentioned the top right tweet of mine there, which is summarising what the Czech President Miloš Zeman has said about it, which is effectively as the de facto expert government in Western and Central Europe now on CBRN. He's saying he doesn't believe the British. Top left is Chancellor Kurz of Austria, the linchpin west-east hinge country, who is neutral from NATO, of course, has gone so far as to say that even if the Russians did kill or attempt to kill Mr. Skripal, which he doubts, he would still not be bounced into action by the British. And I've had an Austrian member of parliament call me up and emphasise that as well. We are not going to do what the British say. We're not going to dance to their tune. And at the bottom there, you see the Dutch newspaper Reformatorisch Dagblad, which is, almost slavishly loyal to the British royal family and establishment, giving space to a young Russia specialist there, who is by no means a Putinist. He's very sceptical about Russia's history. saying it is much more likely that the British did it as a job. And in my blog, I've mentioned that the Irish Times has done so as well, in fact, 2 weeks before the Dutch. So you've got these concentric rings now, the likes of Portugal, Spain, and Central Europe, which are a bit further away from Britain, have more or less gone along with it, with the nominal expulsions of some diplomats, although they've recalled them again quickly, so it was just for show. But only the likes of France, Germany, and Benelux and Ireland are at all playing along with it in public and saying that they believe any of it. So here we have some more exposures of what the British government is about these days. Moving on from the Skripal case, these are a couple of weeks old, but I've kept them because they're important. On the right, it's an unfortunately named site, Pop Bitch, but it has a fairly amazing piece of subtitled footage of the late Max Clifford, who was formerly the celebrity PR supremo and then got jailed for sexual corruption and so on and bullying. There he is in 2008 in footage which the documentary makers in his house at the time were never allowed to show, talking about how every celebrity would come to him and get him to make accusations of sexual misconduct, including with minors, go away. And on the left, we have Guido Fawkes from last month talking about the second unflappable employee of the House of Commons quitting their job after being told to F off by the Speaker of our House of Commons, Mr. Bercow. And in the middle there, Guido has come up with a clip on camera, in fact, of senior Sky News, I don't know if he's Sky News, but Tom Bradby, a senior journalist, interviewing Mr. Bercow and getting a hissy fit. So if he's like that in front of the cameras to a journalist, you can just about imagine what he's like to his own staff behind closed doors. Not pretty. I've also come across this rather intriguing one from the United States. There is a Utah man here who is apparently a pillar of his state Republican Party, who was got at by a clique within his party that called themselves the Buckshot Caucus, who are basically a war party, a neocon type party within the party. And they went trying to get his girlfriend to claim that he had sexually molested her and harassed her, in order to shut him up, because he knew that the party was deliberately being folded. Donors were being called up by this caucus, this group within the party, and being told there's no need to fund the party anymore. We want to collapse it and remake it as something completely different. People can go to the details I've shown on screen there to find it. It's the Kate Daly radio station from Utah, which is on SoundCloud. And it sounds remarkably similar as I'm listening to it to what's happened to UKIP, I have to say.
Yeah, okay. And the next one here, again, we mentioned this last week, that Nicolas Sarkozy in trouble. He's now been charged, is that right?
Yes, the French press isn't giving too much away about this, but it's been rumbling in the background. And what's about to come out, I think, is that the French teamed up with MI6 late last decade, almost exactly 10 years ago now, or maybe longer, and seems to have tipped them off when the Anglo-French unitary state idea was coming to the fore. So that the respective criminal cabals in government could plunder in tandem, shall we say. The French, who were more involved with the Mediterranean, the Italian mafia, and so on, and that's how Sarkozy rose to power through Gaddafi money. They were tipped off that Gaddafi was going off reservation and wanting to set up a dinar for his own region and so on, off the books of the Rothschild banking system, and so they decided to foster the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, the terrorists who then turned up in Manchester and perpetrated that awful atrocity last year. This is the kind of angle that seems to be coming out, particularly the leader of the LIFG, Mr. Belhaj. And so people ought to be very aware of these links that are coming to the fore. Libya and Syria is really two halves of the same coin in this story.
Mm. Okay, thank you for that, Alex. Now, this evening, Ian Crane will be in the studio, I think he has decided now that Fracking Nightmare has come to the end of its run, because he's doing his daily morning live streams at 8:30 every morning on his Facebook page and on his YouTube channel. So tonight it'll be Humanity versus Insanity at 7:30 as the only programme. And he's going to be looking at the coming 5G networks and the preparations for that in cities around the country. And I'll just remind everybody that Alternative View Conference taking place 4th to the 7th of May 2018 in the Horwood House Hotel near Milton Keynes. There's still rooms and tickets available for that. You can find out more at alternativeview.co.uk. Alex Thompson will be speaking at that, as will Brian. So get along to that if you possibly can.
Okay, Alex, you in particular, have been working in the background on the Peter Hofstra case. There's some urgent need for money to help support a legal action to get this man out of the psychiatric gulag. Just take us through a little bit what's happened. I believe that there's been some censorship of the GoFundMe page.
Yes, people are asked to be ready for their generosity, but please don't send money just yet, because it would cause it would be less propriety if we were to collect it on his behalf. It would be far better for the dedicated funding to be set up, and it was done by his great supporter Andy Peacher, whose email and phone number are on screen, and he's very happy to take calls and emails about this. But the problem is that, and this has happened before in his case, as soon as the GoFundMe.com page went up asking for money to help Mr. Hofstra, it was complained about by the clique, probably within North Yorkshire Police, that's been persecuting him all this time, a common purpose flavoured clique. And so the GoFundMe was induced to say this is collecting money for a convicted criminal, but that's beside the point. It's to get him out of psychiatric detention when he's never been seen. But he's asking in total for £20,000 sterling, which is roughly £10,000, €11,000 for his own case. We've got a very good advocate, recommended as conscientious and good, lined up for this, who's given that quote to take it through to the end of a trial, a legal challenge, and the other £10,000 is for his poor mother, who we think is still alive and being held incommunicado, so that the Court of Protection, that infamous court, can be told to do its job, and that needs a barrister. So please keep your whatever funding you can generously supply ready to go, and we will update you on this. There may be a time limit on this coming up soon, because he's got a certain limited window of appeal. You know, Austria being a Napoleonic law country, they don't have the flexibility of a common law system. You do have to pay lawyers, and you have to be on time.
Okay, thank you for that, Alex. And I just wanted to remind people that if we're talking about psychiatric gulags, we're also talking about the gulag of the prison system in UK. Melanie Shaw, well, I'm almost lost for words, really. Melanie Shaw, as an extremely brave whistleblower of child abuse, is still in prison. In theory, she should be out in a few months, but Melanie has, to the best of our knowledge, not got a release date. She's never had a proper release date. And so we're extremely worried as to whether she is going to resurface, or the British state is going to simply keep her in the gulag in order to protect those people in Westminster who know about child abuse and are not telling the truth, who are involved in the covering up of child abuse, or some of them involved in that child abuse itself. So this is disgusting stuff. And remember, of course, Theresa May was Home Secretary and therefore part of the machinery that put Melanie Shaw in prison.
We're going to have to update that, because, of course, Alison Saunders is leaving her job in the Crown Prosecution Service. She is heading to the private sector, where she's going to receive a seven-figure salary, because she's done such a fantastic job in the Crown Prosecution Service, and this is one example of the job that she's done.
Indeed. Well, the people in that little inset image there were in people who were in post at the time that Melanie was put away. And I'm also going to bring on screen Sabine McNeill. She's imprisoned, well, on remand, but she's being treated as a prisoner at HMP Bronzefields. And what has she been doing? Well, challenging the UK government's cover-up of the Hampstead SRA abuse case. And I'm very happy to say on air that having been involved with that family in the earliest days and spoken to the little boy, I didn't speak to the girl, I have no doubt that that abuse case is factually true. The abuse of those children under horrific circumstances did take place. Of course, the British government has closed ranks. And because Sabine has been speaking out, she has now been fitted up. And actually, she's in prison on remand until November. And I'd just like to contrast that with former Royal Navy officer Charles Howson of Plymouth, who's been found guilty on 10 counts of indecent assault of young men. He's walking free while he awaits his trial for more serious charges in June. This is outrageous stuff. And we've got Alex, rage over rape, or the failure of rape prosecutions.
In the top left, people can read my reply to one of the many anguished tweeters about the Telford case, who has been saying, why is it that these Pakistani rape gangs have been allowed to get away with it in Telford? And I've replied, well, look, it's actually about prosecutorial monopoly, which on the continent is de jure. There's no way of getting around it. So it is the problem is the Crown Prosecution Service, with Mrs. Alison Saunders as the outgoing Director of Public Prosecutions, actually has a monopoly on prosecutions, even more so in Scotland than the continent. Private prosecutions are impossible, more or less. And this has caused the problems we're facing. It's not rape gangs on the streets we need to be directing our ire at only, or mainly. It is those enabling it further up. The other thing on that slide, people can go back and freeze if they want to, is the Times coming up with an expose that police forces in Britain are being trained to suppress evidence. They're part of the same plotting going on here. So they're told if a witness statement is going to be exculpatory of evidence, it's going to let the defendant off the hook, then dissuade the witness from giving that statement. And if you've got the evidence, then bury it in the sensitive part of the file that isn't released to the defence under security claims. So the Times has come out with quite an expose on this. The Mail has picked up on it as well. We're starting to see the mechanisms, I think, whereby these abuses are perpetrated on an industrial scale.
Okay, Alex, thank you for that. Well, the clock's on minute 50. We'll just end by reminding people of the NHS conference, Saturday the 12th of May in Nottingham. Very, very important conference. Thank you very much for all of you who've already got online and booked your ticket. This is such an important event, and if this event is the success we hope it will be followed up in the autumn by a more detailed conference looking at some of the specialist areas that need exposing within the failure of wider healthcare for people in the UK. That's it. That's it for today. I'm having real problems today. No UK column news tomorrow, and we will be back on Monday, however.
As usual, yes.
All right, thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.